Hello and welcome to Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson, brought to you by the Center for American Institutions at Arizona State University. This is a very exciting episode. I am thrilled to be joined by the Foreign Minister of the East Turkistan government-in-exile, Salih Hudayar, and the former Prime Minister of the East Turkestan government-in-exile. Is that correct?
Yes.
And for those of you who are watching this on video, you're going to be very impressed because Salih Hudayar is a very young man. Salih, you're 33, 34, something like that?
Yeah. Later this month, in about a week, I'll be 33. So my birthday is coming up on May 21st.
Oh, that's my daughter's birthday. So how about that?
Oh, perfect.
She'll be turning 5. Just yeah, so that's. I assume your birthday party will not be involving a splash pad and pizza.
No, no, no. I'm not really gonna have much of a birthday party. Just getting together with family and friends.
That's great. Well, an early happy birthday to you. Um,
Thank you. Thank
so, are you able to just describe for people listening, first of all, what is a government in exile? And how, and what is the East Turkestan government in exile? And a little bit about your career and how you ended up becoming such a central figure in that.
So, firstly, a government in exile is essentially a political body that is claiming to represent a territory, a government that was in place before it was either overthrown or occupied by another foreign power. So it's essentially forced into exile due to either occupation or, in some cases, where there has been regime change internally. So it's claiming to continue to represent that territory and its people. And because obviously it's based in exile, it doesn't exercise de jure or de facto control over that territory, but it claims to represent that territory and its people on the international stage. So that is essentially the basic breakdown of what a government in exile is under international law. The East Turkestan government in exile is a provisional uh, government in exile. It's a body, democratically elected body, parliamentary based, which represents all of the people of East Turkestan, and it advocates for, it represents East Turkestan's cause on the international stage, and its main mandate is to seek the restoration of East Turkestan's independence and the end of Chinese colonization and occupation. Our government in exile was formed in September 14th of 2004 here in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, we had other bodies that were de facto governments in exile, though not officially, because the host countries where we set those entities up were not allowing us to formally uh, represent ourselves or to call ourselves a government in exile. So previously, initially, it was based out of the Soviet Union through the East Turkestan National Committee. After the PRC invaded and overthrew the East Turkestan Republic on December 22nd, 1949. So many of our governments, the republic's military and political leaders who survived had fled into the Soviet Union, where they set up the East Turkestan National Committee. Then, after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1992, it transformed into the East Turkestan National Congress. And again, that was our de facto government in exile. We tried to, our leaders at the time were trying to get it registered, trying to get it as a government in exile, but because it was based out of Istanbul, which is in Turkey, Turkey was reluctant to, allow us to call it a government in exile. So they said, call it anything else but this. Then, after the Chinese government, they initiated a crackdown, essentially the foundations for the ongoing genocide that we see today. In March of 1996, they held a top secret meeting called on stability maintenance in East Turkestan, specifically to prevent the independence of East Turkestan. And in that, they issued a 10-point directive called Document Number 7. And in that directive, it's a top secret directive. One of the key things, point 8 or Directive 8, calls for co-opting, countries of Turkey, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, where we have diaspora uh, communities and which were the base of our operations, and using them to crush our independence movement. So by 1997, Turkey outlawed our uh, de facto government exile at the time, the East Turkestan National Congress. And then it took a couple years before our leaders were able to persuade folks here in Washington at the time to allow us to formally set up our government exile.
Okay, I mean, and just for the people who are listening, East Turkestan is where in China, and what are the dominant ethnic groups in East Turkestan?
So if you look at the map behind me, this is the map of East Turkestan. East Turkestan is the far northwest area of what is now under the People's Republic of China. The PRC officially calls it the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region since 1955. Xinjiang in the Chinese language means the new territory, or if you look at the original Chinese English dictionary put out by the Manchu Qing Empire back in 1887, they translated it as the colony. So it's clearly new to China and the Chinese, but not to the people who have been living there. So the major ethnic groups in East Turkestan are Uyghurs, who make up, at the time in 1949, when China took over, occupied East Turkestan, we made up about 85% of East Turkestan's population. Combined with the other Turkic population, we were 92% of East Turkestan's population, whereas the Chinese made up less than, the Chinese colonists made up less than 5%. Today, Uyghurs are still the dominant ethnic group, and then the second most dominant ethnic group are the Chinese colonists. Due to 76 years of colonization, they went from less than 5% to over 42%. Then it's followed by other native Turkic groups like Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, as well as Mongols and other small pockets of different ethnic groups.
Um, there's so many questions I have, but I want to get back to your own biography a little bit here for a second before we go any further. How did you end up becoming such a prominent member of this government in exile?
So I came to the United States 26 years ago. In fact, this June will mark 26 years since I fled to the U.S. as a political refugee, or I was forced into exile as a political refugee. I grew up in Oklahoma. Most of my life I spent in Oklahoma. I had a dream to become a military officer, and one day to become a general and to return to liberate my homeland. That was my childhood dream. To pursue that dream, I did ROTC while I was in college. I also was a member of the Oklahoma Army National Guard. Unfortunately, due to after I got an emergency appendectomy, after a field training exercise, it was discovered when they did a scan of my body that I had polycystic kidney disease. So that permanently, disqualified me and killed off my military dream, my military career. So in 2016, as and after that, I said, okay, well, there's got to be another way that I gotta help my people. And so I began to study. I studied political science and international studies. That's what my bachelor's in. And then as I was finishing it up at the University of Oklahoma in 2016, that was my last semester. In the fall of 2016, the election cycle, everybody's talking about being tough on China. So I wrote a policy proposal called Refining the American Grand Strategy from Central Asia to the Uyghurs. And in it, I argued that it was in the U.S. national interest to support East Turkestan's independence. for various reasons, both from the humanitarian reason, the strategic reason, and then even the economic reason. And so by that time, the mass internment campaign, the genocide has already started in May 2014. By 2016, because the international community, pretty much turned a blind eye and allowed China to carry out this genocide, China began to target our entire population for mass internment into so-called re-education camps, which are essentially concentration camps. So I lost a lot of my family members into those camps, and as I was trying to push for, a Uyghur Policy Act modeled off of the Tibetan Policy Act of 2002, I began engaging with various think tanks here in Washington, D.C., as well as congressional committees. And this is when they were, asking, what organization are you part of? And at that time, I'm not part of any organization. So I had one of my professors who was helping me with this process. And she was the one who suggested, before a national independence movement really takes shape, there's a national awakening that happens. And so this is how the East Turkestan National Awakening was born in the name through the help of my professor's suggestion, and then I founded like-minded young Uyghurs and Kazakhs who grew up in the United States like myself, and we founded the East Turkestan National Movement, or the National Awakening Movement at the time, now the National Movement to advocate for our people's political and human rights, including our independence and including recognition of the genocide. So fast forward by 2018, by the summer of 2017, I moved up to DC because in Oklahoma there was no way I could, get this moving. So I moved up to DC. I began engaging in advocacy, both grassroots as well as meeting with Congress, State Department, other places, and trying to get them to raise our issue. And by the end of the summer of 2018, the United States government began to speak out on our issue. They began to condemn the mass internment of our people. We were able to get a Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act introduced by then Senator Marco Rubio, now Secretary Rubio. Not as strong as what I had originally envisioned, but it was still something to get the gears of the U.S. government moving. So this this led to me becoming popular in our diaspora, because not only did we engage in advocacy here in the U.S., but we also mobilized youth in our diaspora across the world to engage in similar advocacy efforts in their host countries. So this led to me essentially becoming very popular in our diaspora. And then in 2019, the government-in-exile, which was already based in DC, they reached out and said, we'd like you to represent us. We've been looking for someone like you for decades. You've done a lot of great things. We share the same goal. We advocate for independence. And the reason I didn't, align with the ETGE at that time or prior to that was because there's two main spectrums within our diaspora, which I highlighted even in my policy proposal. One is the East Turkestan government-in-exile, which advocates specifically for independence and end of the occupation and colonization. And then the other is the World Uyghur Congress, which advocates for, greater autonomy and human rights under China. So I didn't want to feel like I was alienating, or that I didn't want to get one side against me. So I thought, let's just work through Etnam, and then, if we can work with both sides, that would be great. Unfortunately, the human rights folks didn't really agree with my East Turkestani advocacy. In fact, they were unfortunately viciously opposed to it. To even me calling it a genocide, to me even calling it East Turkestan. And they even tried to, use various means, including trying to weaponize the U.S. justice system to try to claim I'm a terrorist because since 2002, really, or 2001, China has stated that anyone who advocates for East Turkestan independence or East Turkestan itself is, part of the so-called ETIM. They're Islamists, they're terrorists. So this was a problem that erupted, and it was only later on that I would discover, as part of my initial defense, because I was uh, falsely accused of being a terrorist for advocating for East Turkestan's independence. And the US, of course, they bought into China's lies for decades. So automatically, like, oh, anyone who advocates for Uyghur independence must be, these Islamist terrorists, because that's the narrative that China had pushed out for decades. Finally, the U.S. government, they dropped the false case against me after realizing this was part of China's strategy to undermine and to prevent our independence movement. So this is how I came to know about document number 7 from 1996. Then I was like, okay, you know what? The government in exile, we share the same goal. So I ended up becoming the representative, the ambassador of the government in exile for the U.S. Then in June of 2019, every 4 years, the government in exile has parliamentary elections in our diaspora community in host nations. So I became one of the candidates for our parliament here, out of the representing our diaspora community here in Washington D.C. I mean, in not Washington D.C. in the United States. And then at the Eighth General Assembly, despite my opposition, I had no intention of becoming a prime minister or anything of that sort. But because of my popularity, some of the members nominated me as a candidate for the prime minister position, and out of the three of us were nominated. Out of the three folks, I got the most votes, and I ended up becoming the prime minister for about from 2019 till 2023. During that period, the first thing I did was file a. I led the government in exile, the national movement, to file a legal complaint, first ever legal complaint, before the International Criminal Court to hold China accountable for genocide and crimes against humanity. Um, Everything we asked for in that. Also, the United States was very helpful. The first Trump administration, um, you know, literally a week after we, not even a week, like 3 days after we filed this legal complaint, they sanctioned the Xinjiang Production Construction Corps, which is a paramilitary colonial apparatus that is involved in the mass enslavement and the colonization and genocide of our people. And that was something that we had directly mentioned in our filings before the ICC. So I served as the prime minister from 2019 till 2023, and then a new government leadership was elected in November of 2023. And the new government, the new president, the prime minister, vice president, and the speaker of the parliament and deputy speaker of the parliament, those are the positions that get elected, and then they in turn form a government cabinet. They asked me to stay on in the government leadership, and they appointed me as the foreign minister of the East Turkestan government exile.
Wow. I now have about 10,000 questions after that I'd like to dig into, but I'm gonna kind of maybe bring us back a little bit to kind of big picture. Who are the Uyghurs? Can you give us a little bit of a
So the
background as to their history and who they are, their communities?
Yes. So the Uyghurs are essentially the modern Uyghurs. We are a hybrid nation. In fact, the U.S. and other governments, even China, has studied our genetic background. We're a hybrid mix of the native Indo-European peoples that have been inhabiting East Turkestan for over 6,000 years, and the Turkic groups that have been inhabiting East Turkestan and its surroundings for at least the past 4,000 years. And this intermixture, according to the uh, anthropologists and geneticists happened about anywhere from 2,500 to 2,900 years ago. So this is who the Uyghurs are. We are the native population of East Turkestan. Ethnically, as I mentioned, we're both Indo-European and Turkic. Our language is mostly Turkic. We are closely related to Uzbeks. In fact, that's the most closest ethnic group in the world to the Uyghurs are the Uzbeks. Outside of that, we're related to other Turkic groups like Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Turks, etc.
Um, do you have your own distinct language?
Yes. So our people are called Uyghur. Our language is called Uyghur as well. In fact, even the term Uyghur, it was revived by the Soviets. Prior to that, we were just called Turks, and our language was called Eastern Turkey. In 1921, the Soviets, 1921 or 24, one of those 2 days, if I recall correctly, they held a conference in Tashkent where they are like, okay, we need to designate a different name for these ethnic groups on the eastern side of Turkestan. Because Turkestan is the whole of Central Asia, West Turkestan is under the Soviet Union. So to distinguish us from those across the border, they're like, we need to come up with a different name for these people. So this is where they revived the name Uyghur based off of the Uyghur Khaganate from the 7th to 9th century. And so that became the predominant name of our ethnic group, the non-nomadic Turkic peoples in East Turkestan. So since then, we've been known as Uyghurs. But prior to that, we were referred to as either Turks or Eastern Turks. That's why our country's name is Eastern Turkestan.
Sound right. Okay, and so before there were two East Turkestani republics, as far as I know, correct? And
Yes.
they were in the 20th century. So
Yes.
who was governing this region up until the Soviets emerge?
So, our history throughout history, East Turkestan has been governed by numerous Indo-European and Turkic kingdoms, states, and empires that emerged from East Turkestan. So, in the ancient past, 2,000 years ago, we had city-states, over 36 city-states across East Turkestan. Then we were part of the Hun Empire, or what the Chinese call the Xingnu Empire. Then the Turks, the Gök Turks, emerged out of northern East Turkestan, and that's why our country is called Turkestan. Is because Turkestan means the land of the Turks or the country of the Turks, and it first emerged in response to the describing the territories of the Turkic Khaganate.
Hmm.
Then the Turkic Khaganate was overthrown in a coup d'etat by one of the tribes, which is the Uyghur tribe, and then they created in its place the Uyghur Empire or the Uyghur Khaganate. Then it turn was overthrown by another Turkic tribe, and then in its place, we had the Kukturk, the Karhanads from the 9th till the 13th century, as well as western part of East Turkestan was under their control, and then the eastern and northern part of East Turkestan was under the control of the Idkut Uyghur kingdom, which was the one of the remnants of the previous Uyghur Khaganate. And then from the 14th to about the 16th century, East Turkestan was part of the Chagatai Khanate under the Mongols. Then in the 16th century, in 1514, we established the Yarkand Khanate, and, which lasted until 1705. Then it was overthrown by the Mongols, Jungars, and from 1705 to 1759, we were the Jungars were pretty much our overlords, you could say, and there were small kingdoms that represented their, controlled their own areas. Then in 1756, the Manchu Qing dynasty invaded East Turkestan and occupied it in 1759. And then from 1759 till 1863, we were ruled as a military colony of the Qing Empire. And during that period, our people organized 42 major armed uprisings against the Qing Empire to secure our independence. And then in 1864, we succeeded in restoring our independence as the state of Yettishar, or the state of the seven cities, referring to the major seven cities in East Turkestan. And we had we established diplomatic relations and received recognition from both the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the British Empire. Then in 1876, the Manchu Qing Empire, supported by the Russian Empire, invaded East Turkestan, and then in 1870, in December of 1877, they occupied us, and then in 1884 is when they formally incorporated and tried to annex East Turkestan as Xinjiang, meaning the new territory. But between 1884 till about 1912, we resisted. There was at least 24 uprisings against the Qing occupation as well. Then, after the Qing Empire fell in 1912 due to the Chinese Revolution, we also had several instances from to try to reestablish our independence as well. But it wasn't fruitful until 1931, when all of our different groups came together and merged as a anti-colonial national liberation movement, and we succeeded in restoring our independence as the East Turkestan Republic on November 12, 1933, before the Soviet Union intervened, and used Chinese Muslims and Chinese warlords to overthrow our state. And then from 1934 till 1937, it was under a Chinese warlord. In 1937, we successfully liberated the southern half of our country and established an independent government. But again, this led to a direct Soviet invasion of East Turkestan, and they propped up the Chinese warlord again. And then from 1937 to 1943, it was ruled by a Soviet-aligned Chinese warlord. And then in 1943, our independence movement again re-strengthened, and we were able to resist against the Chinese. And in 1944, November 12th, we declared independence again as the Second East Turkestan Republic. The Soviet Union briefly supported us the second time, not because they were, they're the ones who've been crushing us previously. They needed access to East Turkestan's uranium in northern East Turkestan, and they wanted to use East Turkestan as a pressure point against the Republic of China to recognize and secure Outer Mongolia's independence. So we maintained our independence until December of 1949, but in August of 1949, Stalin had pretty much, by early 1949, the Soviet Union had pretty much agreed to extinguish East Turkestan with Mao. And in August of 1949, all of our top leaders were called to a meeting in the Soviet Union, and then they were killed in a staged plane crash. Then a further 30 senior political and military leaders were also assassinated by the Soviet intelligence to prevent a effective resistance against the planned Chinese Communist invasion.
Mm-hmm. So, until the 18th century, East Turkestan was governed by, or tended to be part of, or governed, it itself controlled, it was a part of, either way, it was governed by Turkic peoples.
Yes.
Right?
It was governed by the native peoples. Like many of these Turkic empires that you saw in Central Asia from that period, all of them originated from East Turkestan.
Okay.
We were the ones who spread out before, we became conquered ourselves, unfortunately.
Right. Okay. But then since the 18th century, East Turkestan being on the frontier between a Chinese empire, Chinese empire in various forms and a Russian empire in various forms, has led to either being conquered by, predominantly it sounds like by Chinese, by Beijing, by various Chinese regimes, and then briefly
Yeah,
controlled
well,
by Russia
yeah,
suddenly.
the Qing, was they're essentially Manchus. They conquered China. They're not
Sure.
Chinese, but after 1912, the Chinese tried to conquer us and only succeeded after 1949.
Right.
Again, because of the Russian support, because we were caught in between three major
Right.
powers: the Chinese on one side, the Russians on the other side, and then the
Yeah.
British. The Russians, why they supported the Qing to reconquer East Turkestan in 1876 is because they were afraid of East Turkestan being very close to the British, and then the British using East Turkestan as a base to pressure Russia in West Turkestan.
Sure.
Similarly, Stalin's calculations was the same. In fact, in the secret telegram that he now declassified telegram that he sent to Mao, he was the one who ordered Mao to quickly occupy East Turkestan because he feared that if not, the British would get involved and that they would instigate or that they would that's what the Russians claimed, that they would instigate the Muslim population there against both the Chinese, the Chinese communists, as well as against the Soviets, which occupied, former
Right.
West Turkestan, now Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan,
Okay.
Uzbekistan, so forth.
So it's this frontier, it's this region again. It's this border. It's a. It has the misfortune of being on the border of some very, very powerful neighbors.
Yes.
And although historically it itself was a very powerful entity, although in modern history they're maybe eclipsed by some of its neighbors. And also my understanding is there's quite a lot of critical minerals there and has been for several like important for at least for the 20th century. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes. East Turkestan is the economic, political, and even military powerhouse for China. The key reason is one, East Turkestan makes up roughly 1,828,000 square kilometers, 400, 1,828,400 12 square kilometers, or which is roughly the size of over a little larger than Alaska, almost three times the size of the U.S. state of Texas. So it is massive in terms of in terms of its size, and it makes up about a fifth of what is now known as what is controlled by the PRC. In addition to that, over 30% of the oil and natural gas reserves that China claims it controls comes from East Turkestan. Over 40% of the coal reserves comes from East Turkestan. An estimated 20% or more of the critical minerals, including rare earth minerals that China claims that is its own, comes from East Turkestan. The electricity from East Turkestan powers over 120 Chinese cities in 20 different Chinese provinces. China has conducted all of its nuclear tests in East Turkestan from 1964 until most recently. The U.S. State Department, U.S. government claims that China conducted a underground tactical nuclear test back in 2020 in East Turkestan. All of those 47 nuclear tests have been carried out in East
Oh.
Turkestan. China, you might have heard of China expanding its nuclear and intercontinental ballistic missile silos in the deserts of so-called Western China. All of that is in East Turkestan. You might have heard about China expanding and centralizing all of its critical database centers and AI database centers in the deserts of Western China. That's also in East Turkestan. If you know anything about the Belt and Road Initiative, the multi-trillion-dollar China's, so-called global infrastructure project, which is actually a project to which has severe military and political implications, to essentially, assert Chinese dominance and to pave the way for Chinese global dominance in the coming decades. The cornerstone of that is East Turkestan itself. Without East Turkestan, there is no Belt and Road. Without East Turkestan, China's abilities to, develop, its abilities to rise into this global power is very limited. And this is precisely why China has been trying to, they went from slow motion colonization to we have to wipe these people out, is because they see us as an obstacle for their expansionist plans. In fact, a Chinese military strategist in 2009, they held a seminar at China's National Defense University over the future war between China and the United States over Taiwan, which they speculated was going to happen around 2030. And in that, they said, we have the capabilities to take Taiwan right now, but one thing is preventing us from doing that. What does anyone in here know what this one thing is? All these Chinese military intelligence officials name different things. And the key lecturer, who later became the head of China's National Defense University, a general named Dai Shu, he stated, it's the East Turkestan problem. Because if we were to prematurely launch an invasion of Taiwan without resolving this issue, in addition to the U.S. blockading the Strait of Malacca and preventing us from, getting the resources that we need to conduct this war, the United States could easily arm 300,000 to 500,000 Uyghurs overnight and cut off our west to east pipelines and energy grids. And this is why he said we need to resolve this problem immediately. And he said, I propose we do this under the framework of, counterterrorism. But of course, we know that's not the truth. And so this is essentially what's been happening. As soon as Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, he launched the Belt and Road Initiative in Kazakhstan during his visit to Kazakhstan. And there he made one statement. He said, by the end of this century, the world will speak Chinese. And he was not saying that in a very, in like a figurative way. He was being very literal, because what we see as part of the Belt and Road is the expansion of Chinese influence and Chinese Confucius institutes all across these countries. Like, for example, in Uzbekistan, Chinese is now a language that is being taught in their schools from, elementary to, university. It's one of those mandatory languages that is being taught. In many of these countries that are connected to the Belt and Road, it's the same mandatory thing. Even in the United States, though recently, the past few years, the U.S. has, pushed back against China's Confucius Institute. There were Confucius Institutes all across the United States, even in the University of Oklahoma. I was prevented from participating in the homecoming parade representing East Turkestan because of the Chinese Confucius Institute's pressure, that they had leverage that they had over the university.
Interesting.
So East Turkestan is very vital to China. It's, this is why much of even the critical minerals there are coming from East Turkestan. We have uranium, titanium, beryllium, lithium, zirconium. Many of these are minerals that are necessary not just for, technology in terms of like computers, phones, and other electronic components, but also for military capabilities, including, building stealth technology, missiles and so forth.
Hmm. Wow. I mean, as you were saying this, it clicks in my head that the importance of East Turkestan to the Belt and Road Initiative, the crackdown, which is theoretically, as you mentioned, a counterterrorism operation, which is a response to two attacks, two specific attacks. So I think there were more than that. The knife attack and then the Urumqi market attack. But the Urumqi market attack is 2013, right?
It's 2014.
2014.
So
Okay.
I can give you a background
Yeah, but
on this. So
just before I do that, I'm just going to kind of finish my thought, and then I'll let you, because I think it's relevant, that the Belt and Road Initiative, if it requires East Turkestan and it requires solving the quote East Turkestan problem, um, is it a coincidence that the crackdown happens basically at the same time that the Belt and Road Initiative is launched?
Absolutely not.
Right.
Absolutely not. In fact, so if we go back in history, after the fall of the Soviet Union, West Turkestan became independent as Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and so forth. So we have millions of people in our diaspora in those countries. Those countries were our base of operations for our independence movement. So now we began to engage and we began to revamp our independence movement on the international stage. And China freaked out. So in March of 1996, the CCP Politburo Standing Committee, the top 7 leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, led by then Chinese leader Jiang Zemin, held a top secret meeting on preventing East Turkestan's independence and issued a 10-point directive. Directive 8 in that specifically calls for co-opting Turkey, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and suppressing our independence movement in those countries, to engaging in dialogue with our diaspora organizations, communities, winning over most of them to China's side.
Unfortunately, I think we lost Salih here. Connectivity problems, which is too bad because I think we were really.
I apologize, not sure what happened to my internet connection. Where was we?
I'd really like you to go back, probably make this easier. Just begin your answer to the question that I asked.
Yeah. So essentially, yes, this is not a coincidence at all. In fact, this has been long Chinese government strategy. This goes back, in fact, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the former West Turkestan, the independent Turkic republics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan gained their independence. So this led to a resurgence in our independence movement because we have millions of people in those countries. So in response to the resurgence of our independence movement on the global stage, China's Communist Party's standing committee, their Politburo standing committee, top 7 members of the Chinese Communist Party, led by Jiang Zemin, held a top secret meeting in Beijing on preventing East Turkestan's independence. And there they issued a top secret document called Document Number 7 of 1996, which contains 10 main directives, essentially a blueprint for the genocidal policies that we will see in the coming decades. The specific point that I want to highlight, which directly answers this question, is point number 8, which calls for co-opting the governments of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkey, which are the home bases for our independence movement, and using them to crush our independence movement. In addition to that, it calls for co-opting our diaspora organizations, communities, and leaders to China's side, the majority of them, and then to alienate and marginalize the remaining so-called separatists, meaning those who refuse to give up on independence. Then it calls for using all means necessary to prevent the internationalization of the East problem, including propaganda, making broad and deep friends to limit our so-called separatist activities, meaning our pro-independence activities. Immediately after that, China launches the Strike Hard campaign against national separatism. That was the first Strike Hard campaign. The current genocide, they call it the Strike Hard campaign against violent terrorism, and I'll come into that in a little bit. So China does that. Then China lays down the foundation for the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. In April of 1996, it creates the Shanghai Five organization, which is the precursor of the SCO. Then China coordinates with Pakistan's intelligence, Turkish intelligence, and they began to divide our diaspora organizations, and they began to create a so-called Islamist narrative out there. In fact, the Observer, the UK's Observer, had warned at that time that Western experts are reporting that China is trying to connect the Uyghur independence movement to Islamic fundamentalism in order to um, prevent international support for the movement before it's even known. So by 1998, China successfully crushes our independence movement in Turkey, in Central Asia, to where we have to flee. Our leaders that survived fled to Europe, to North America, etc. After 2001, immediately China claims that it is a victim, after the 9/11 attacks, that it is a victim of so-called East Turkistani terrorism, and it fabricates the East Turkestan Islamic movement, or this term, and states that they are trying to fight for the creation of an Islamic caliphate, etc., and that they are against the United States, they're against the West. These are terrorists, so therefore my enemy is your enemy. And it pressures the U.S. to list it lists about 40 different organizations that it wants the U.S. to list as a terrorist organization. The U.S. refuses, but it pretty much appeases China in order to get China not to veto the U.S. entrance into Iraq. So the U.S. is like, okay, I'll register or list the ETIM as a terrorist organization, because one, the U.S. could later on walk back on it, because one, there's no group ever calling itself that. Prior to November 11th, 2001, even the Chinese had never mentioned anything like that. And so this is the framework that China used. In 2020, the United States government revoked, that designation of the ETIM, because stating that, over the past 2 decades, we have not found any evidence other than China claiming that there's such an entity, that this group exists. And that's why the US revoked it. Then, as we mentioned, China launches the Belt and Road Initiative. And then Xi Jinping visits East Turkestan because, again, China has to justify this genocidal campaign under the framework of counterterrorism. If not, it's going to have problems in the international stage. So Xi Jinping visits East Turkestan in April of 2014. When he visits East Turkestan, he visits Chinese military bases there. And this is where, if you read the New York Times report from 2019, where they absolutely show no mercy, the over 1,000 pages of Chinese internal top secret documents laying down, how China's engaging in genocide against our people. That directive was given by Xi Jinping when he visited a Chinese military base in East Turkestan. 2 days later, his plane takes off from East Turkestan. A few hours after his plane takes off, there's a bombing that happens at a train station in Urumqi. And immediately China's like, this is done by East Turkestani terrorists. Even Western experts, from the Jamestown Foundation to the UK Sandhurst military academies, they said this is weird. Why would the Uyghurs, who have historically always targeted Chinese military and government personnel, all of a sudden engage in this indiscriminate bombing that would undermine their own cause? Like, this does not make any sense. Uyghur groups in exile, we said, we suspect this is a Chinese intelligence false flag. Nobody took it, nobody took the Chinese government seriously for its claims. Then, less than a month later, another bombing happens, this time at a vegetable market on May 21st or 22nd. And there, China again claims this is done by East Turkestani terrorists who want to establish a global Islamic caliphate. And we have a terrorist problem, so we are launching the People's War Against Terrorism. That's the official euphemism that they use for its ongoing campaign of genocide. Again, these indiscriminate bombings This is something that doesn't correlate with all the previous acts of resistance carried out by Uyghurs that Uyghurs themselves have claimed. You know, so in essence, it was just to justify. We believe it's the Chinese intelligence false flag to justify its genocidal campaign, and it won international sympathy. And then China claimed, oh, these are tied to, ISIS. They began trying to claim, oh, these Uyghurs are tied to ISIS, they're tied to Al Qaeda, all these different things to win the international community's silence. And for the first couple of years, from 2014 to 2016, the international community did, well, until really 2017, the international community did, buy into China's lies until China began, because initially they targeted men between the ages of 15 to 45, that these people are prone to become radicalized. They have, uh, extremist tendencies, etc. This is why we're, re-educating them. Then by 2017, everyone, they came out with 48 different reasons why you had to be re-educated. They sent 1.2 million Chinese officials to live in our homes with us, to monitor us, and to essentially grade us from 0 to 100. Anyone who scored less than 90 was deemed unreliable and had to be re-educated. So things that made you lose points was if you're a young man under 65 and you have even this much of facial hair, you're a terrorist. If you are a young man and you're working out, you're going to the gym or you have gym equipment, you're a terrorist. If you have camping equipment, you're a terrorist. If you have ever traveled overseas into any country, you have ties to foreign extremists, you're not, you're not safe. You're unreliable. Um, if you believe in any religion, whether that's Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, etc., those are alien ideological viruses. So you've been exposed to alien ideological viruses. You have to be re-educated. If you had more than two children, um, you violated the family, birth control uh, policy. You have to be re-educated. So the number of people that became detained swelled up to millions. The U.S. Department of War, now then Department of Defense, stated in May of 2019 that they estimated that 3 million or more Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples had been thrown into concentration camps. The Chinese government itself, in its 2020 white paper, defending these concentration camps as vocational training centers and re-education centers, claimed that between 2014 till the end of 2019, they sent 1.29 million people per year, or roughly 7.8 million people over the course of 6 years, to quote vocational training, providing them job training, for teaching them the Chinese laws, languages, etc.
Yeah. So can you go into a little bit what is meant by re-education? They use that as a euphemism, but what actually happened in these camps?
So re-education is essentially an all-in-one term for forced political indoctrination, torture, rape, forced medication, organ harvesting, essentially to make you a slave, to either kill you, uh, if they can't break you, they'll kill you, to enslave you. Essentially, this is what it is, to become what the Chinese government wants you to be. So our people are forcibly, indoctrinated. They spend 14 hours, chained like this, staring at a TV screen in a small cell with 20 others, and listening to Chinese Communist propaganda, listening to Xi Jinping's speeches. They can't talk to one another. Anyone who doesn't sing and memorize those, communist songs, they're not given food. If they try to even utter anything in Uyghur, or if they say I can't learn this or I don't want to, they're taken and beaten. They're forcibly medicated. The Chinese government has expanded, or has China's government has been um, harvesting the organs of millions of our people. Experts believe, like Ethan Gutman, they believe that anywhere from 25,000 to 50,000 Uyghurs between the ages of 18 to about 31 are being killed every single year for their organs. So since 2014 till now, they estimate anywhere from 250,000 to over 500,000 Uyghurs have been killed just for their organs alone.
Wow.
And China's government not only does it deny this, but at the same time, while denying this, it's saying that it's expanding. It declared that it's going to expand the number of organ transplant centers, as they call it, which is organ harvesting centers, in East Turkestan by threefold by 2030. The Chinese government, when it released its white paper in 2019, in 2020, it stated that we've shut down these concentration camps or uh, these re-education camps. Many of them have graduated, they're working in jobs. The only thing that has changed, because there's over 1,400 camps, you can view this on Google Earth, on satellite imagery. The only thing that has changed is they removed the watchtowers in in many of these concentration camps, and around it they built massive industrial complexes. So the Chinese government's own white paper, which the UN actually UN experts highlighted in February 2026, warning that what the Chinese government was doing was mass enslavement as a form of crime against humanity, against our people. The Chinese government, from their 2021 to 2025 5-year plan, instructed that they need to engage in at least 13.75 million labor transfers, using us as slaves. Just in 2025 alone, that was 3.4 million labor transfers happened in East Turkestan. And this is not stopping, it's still unfortunately ongoing. Um, you know, um, Hundreds of thousands of our women have been forcibly sterilized. In many parts of East Turkestan, especially in the south, they put up a 0% population growth rate, which means they don't want our population to grow. And experts have warned that in the coming 2 decades, this would reduce our population by 4.5 million. At the same time, China's continuing to send tens of thousands of Chinese colonists every single month, giving them, incentives like free housing, cash, um, supplements, allowing them to have multiple children, and even, forcing our women to marry Chinese men, stating that, oh, you'll even get a local pretty ethnic wife if you come settle in East Turkestan, or what they call Xinjiang. So it's genocide in every form,
Yeah.
in every sense of the UN Genocide Convention.
Oh, I mean, what? Yeah. So the re-education camps turned into slave labor camps. Is essentially what seems to have happened.
Yes, part of it slave labor camps, the majority of it, and the other part of it is just organ harvesting, death
Right.
camps.
Organ harvesting
Um,
death camps. Yeah.
because the Chinese government itself stated in 2017, and in 2018, they reported that they collected the DNA samples, voice prints, and retina scans of 36 million people in East Turkestan.
Hmm.
What is that being used for? Again, to collect, who to match organ tissue quickly, and that's why our healthiest people are being randomly, because many of the survivors and even Chinese police officers who had served in East Turkestan in these camps, they confirmed that. They said, the healthier ones, we take them away for organ harvesting.
Hmm. Where can people go to read up more about this?
Well, the easiest thing to do is to just Google, Uyghur genocide, on and learn, from the various reports, both news reports and studies that have been done. To learn more about East Turkestan, people can visit our website at east-turkestan.net, or follow us on social media at etexile.gov.
Okay. I want to be sensitive of your time here. We're coming up on the hour. So I don't, I'm going to ask you one last, I'm going to ask you another question. You can feel free to answer this one and we go no further, but I do want to be sensitive of your time here. Um, why has the international community, the Uyghur issue, like the Uyghur genocide, was big international news in 2017, 2018, and 2019? since COVID, it seems to have fallen off of the radar in the international community. Why do you think that is? Or am I wrong with that? Or why do you think that is?
No, you are absolutely right. One of the main reasons was, COVID happened, and so China. I mean, even when COVID happened, actually, it was still a big issue. But it was actually after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This gave Xi Jinping and China a break, because China essentially greenlit Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it was able to mask, take the attention away from itself to another, pressing issue in the global community. And governments around the world, as they were pressuring and trying to hold Russia accountable, because China is Russia's main supporter and even now, they felt that, oh, in order to get China to press Russia to stop its invasion, we have to, be sensitive to China's concerns, to China's, framing. So let's not raise this issue anymore. And essentially, that's what happened. Governments stopped speaking about it, and when government stops speaking about it, the media doesn't care.
Hmm.
Despite the fact, even activists, even though we try to speak about it, media does media doesn't care about that. They look at that. So we essentially got traded away. And even after that, then you had the conflict in the Middle East, between Israel and Hamas, that broke out, and that also, China used that to its advantage, trying to portray itself as a defender of the Palestinians, as a defender of Muslim peoples, etc. And it began to put out a counter propaganda. They were essentially putting out waves and waves of propaganda stating that, there is no genocide happening here. The actual thing is over here. Look at this. You know, what we're doing here is we're fighting against terrorism. We're um, treating the Uyghurs well. All of this is lies. And at the end of the day, short question: governments appease China, and this is still ongoing. Unfortunately, our president, uh, Trump, is currently in Beijing now, trying to discuss, a trade deal among other issues, including critical minerals. We reiterated to the U.S. government to raise our issue, to take, our issue to directly raise it with Xi Jinping. Because imagine if Roosevelt had recognized the Holocaust, or the US government had recognized the Holocaust, the genocide of Jews and millions of others, under Nazi Germany, and then after recognizing it a few years later, sitting down with Hitler like it was no problem. This would be something that the world would not forgive. This would be something that the American people would never forgive, and it would be completely against America's own fundamental values and principles. And essentially, that's what we are seeing right now. This is a genocide that the US government, under the Trump administration itself, recognized as an ongoing genocide, reaffirmed by, uh, the Biden administration and others as well. And even the UN is stating that this is still ongoing. So we are deeply concerned about this, and we hope that at the very least, he has an opportunity to, invoke like a Reagan style moment where he can look directly in the eye. How uh, Reagan told Gorbachev to tear down the wall. He can look directly in the eye of Xi Jinping and say, "Stop this genocide. Stop this, colonial occupation, and set these captive nations free." We are listed as a captive nation under the United States 1959 Captive Nations Law, which specifically states that it's in the U.S. national interest to keep the desire for independence and liberty of these captive nations alive, and to support them in any way that we can to recover their liberty and independence. And that's all we're asking from the United States, is to support us, if they can. If they can't, at least to, stop engaging in any form of deals, that would allow China to continue its genocidal campaign and its colonial occupation of our country.
Um, Fair enough. I mean, I think when we think of China, the threat posed by China, what you've done really, I mean, aside from advocating very strongly for your people here, and this has been very enlightening for me. So I really appreciate that. But I hope listeners take one of the things that they take from this is that East Turkestan is at the center of the global competition between the United States and China and Russia, frankly. The the malign bloc or whatever we're going to call it, Iran, Russia, and China, the East, the resources, both human and and mineral, and the agriculture. I mean, the cotton. We know. People I think know about the huge cotton fields and whatnot in East Turkestan. Is controlling that and optimizing that through coerced labor, through slave labor, is necessary for China to be able to not only export, not only become the dominant economic power in the world, but to export its ideology around the world. And so East Turkestan um, is at the center of the economic conflict that probably will define the next 100 years. So
Yes,
even if
and
some Americans are tired of talking about human rights and are worried that a foreign policy based around solely around human rights is maybe not in America's best interest. I happen to think that it is, but some people do think that it's not in America's best interest. Hopefully, they can at least look at the resources that are involved in East Turkestan and the people, the people that are there yearning for a non-Chinese overlord as rationale to at least not lose sight of the importance of liberty for East Turkestan and self-determination for East Turkestan.
yes, and I'd like to finish off with adding with one important point. I mean, East Turkestan is both, what powers China, but it's also China's Achilles heels. Um, since 2005 up until, even their latest 2026 or 2025 national defense strategies, in all of it, China lists preventing East Turkestan's independence or preventing the creation of East Turkestan, as it writes it, as one of its top four national defense goals. So East Turkestan is strategically vital for China. Without East Turkestan, it's the end of the Belt and Road. It's the end of Chinese dominance, and the end of their plan to become the sole global superpower. And that's China's plan. What they're doing in East Turkestan is essentially a test base for what they want to do in other parts of the world. Because, quite frankly, when they came to us, they offered the same bullcrap lies. We want to help you. We want to work with you. We want to help develop and modernize your country. We're here to help you, help you save yourself from, foreign imperialism, etc., etc. When in reality, the Chinese are the foreign imperialists. They're the ones who, are engaging this colonization. As I mentioned earlier, there's no other case of worse colonization and occupation than our case in the past 100, 200 years. In the past 200 years. In 1949, the Chinese colonists made up less than 5%. Today, 76 years later, they're over 42%. Our population, we were 92%. We're now barely 55%. If they finish us off, they're going to expand further west into Central Asia, into South Asia, into Taiwan, the Indo-Pacific. So supporting East Turkestan's restoration of its independence is not only in the national interest of the United States and multiple other countries, not just from a human rights perspective, but from a strategic, from a military, and from an economic perspective.
Yeah.
All to break free from China's control chokehold over critical minerals. you you know, East Turkestan is the best option for that as well.
Well, Minister Hudayar, thank you very much for your time. This has been a great conversation, and you keep up the efforts, and hopefully you'll come on again, and we can get further updates.
Perfect. Thank you for having.